Roy had always been the kind of guy who appreciated the simple things in life: peace and quiet, a steady routine, and the comfort of his own space. He wasn't antisocial by any means, but he valued his privacy. After long days of writing code and troubleshooting software, the last thing he wanted was unnecessary noise or drama. That's why buying his house felt like such a win. It was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, just the right size for one person. The streets were lined with trimmed lawns and friendly neighbors who smiled and waved but didn't pry. That's exactly how Roy liked it: calm, predictable, and low maintenance. But the part of the house Roy loved most wasn't the living room or the backyard. It was a garage. From the moment he moved in, he had big plans for it. He spent months transforming the space into his dream home office. New insulation, high-speed internet wiring, a sleek desk setup, and even a mini fridge stocked with coffee and snacks. It was perfect, a place where he could lose himself in his work without interruption. It meant giving up a place to park his car, but Roy was fine with that. He had a driveway and a carport for rainy days. More importantly, his home office gave him the quiet and control he needed to stay productive. For the first couple of years, life was exactly how Roy wanted it. He kept to himself, respected the HOA rules, and enjoyed the comfort of knowing he could work and relax without anyone bothering him. But peace is fragile, and sometimes it only takes one person to unravel it. Roy first noticed Cheryl when a line of moving trucks clogged the street. It was impossible not to notice. The movers were unloading what looked like half a furniture showroom, while Cheryl stood at the curb, hands on her hips, barking out orders. Roy had been working in his garage when she showed up at his door later that afternoon. "Hi, I'm Cheryl, your new neighbor." She gave him a bright smile, but it felt a little forced. Roy smiled back. "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood." Her smile tightened. "Thanks. I was actually wondering if you could move your car. It's making it hard for the movers to park." Roy glanced at his car. It was parked perfectly within the lines of his own driveway. "I think it's fine where it is," Roy said carefully. Cheryl's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, it would really help if you moved it." Roy hesitated for a moment before deciding it wasn't worth the argument. He moved his car down the street. When he walked back, Cheryl was standing there, watching him. "Appreciate it," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Roy shrugged it off. Moving day is stressful for everyone. He figured Cheryl was just overwhelmed. But the way she stood there, looking at his house like she was taking notes, left him with an uneasy feeling. It was the kind of feeling that sticks with you, even when you try to ignore it. It didn't take long for Cheryl to make her mark. Within weeks, she wasn't just settled, she was running things. Most new neighbors took time to settle in before getting involved in the HOA. Not Cheryl. She showed up at her first HOA meeting with a folder of proposals and a confident smile. By the next meeting, she was sitting on the board. "She's organized," Roy's neighbor, Tom, had said with chuckle. A little intense, though. Roy wasn't particularly concerned at first. He wasn't the type to get involved in HOA politics. He paid his dues on time and kept his property in line with the rules. What did it matter who was on the board? But Cheryl's influence started to spread fast. New regulations popped up, limits on garden decorations, stricter rules about trash pickup, and even fines for leaving out lawn furniture. It wasn't long before Roy got his first official warning. The letter was crisp and professional. "Your succulent garden is not in compliance with HOA regulations. Please remove the unapproved plants within 7 days." Roy stared at the letter, confused. His succulents were neat and tidy, far better maintained than some of his neighbors' overgrown flower beds. He'd chosen them because they were low maintenance and drought resistant. Why was he being singled out? But Roy brushed it off. One letter wasn't a big deal, until the second one came. Trash bins left out beyond the approved collection window may result in fines. Roy always pulled his bins in as soon as possible, but sometimes work ran late, and he'd forget for a couple of hours. Now Cheryl was keeping track of his trash schedule. Roy started to notice Cheryl more often, walking her dog past his house, glancing toward his garage when the door was open. He tried to tell himself he was imagining it, but deep down he knew he wasn't. Cheryl wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was watching him, Roy had always been patient, but Cheryl was wearing him down. One afternoon, he was working in his garage, organizing his tool wall, when Cheryl's voice cut through the air. "Hey, Roy." Roy looked up. Cheryl was standing at the edge of his driveway, her hands on her hips. "Garage doors are supposed to stay closed unless you're actively using them," she said sweetly. "I'm literally using it right now," Roy replied, trying to keep his tone even. "Just letting you know." Cheryl smiled and walked away. Roy clenched his jaw. Cheryl's tone was always friendly on the surface, but there was something beneath it, a quiet, persistent need control. It was getting harder and harder to ignore. Roy's friends told him to push back, but he didn't want to start a war with his neighbor. He figured if he kept his head down, Cheryl would eventually get bored. But Cheryl wasn't the kind of person who got bored. She was the kind of person who escalated. It had been raining all day, one of those heavy, gray downpours that made the whole neighborhood feel soggy and sluggish. Roy was in the middle of the Zoom call when he heard a loud car horn from outside. He ignored it. He was presenting to a big client, but when the meeting ended, he stepped outside to stretch his legs. And there it was, Cheryl's SUV, sitting under his carport like it belonged there. Cheryl was leaning casually against the driver's side door, scrolling on her phone. Roy's stomach tightened. He walked toward her, trying to stay calm. "Hey, everything okay?" "Oh, hi, Roy." Cheryl smiled without looking up from her phone. "The street's flooding. I figure it was better to park here." Roy's jaw tightened. "This is private property." Cheryl finally looked up. "It's an emergency." Roy shook his head slowly. "You should have asked. I figured you wouldn't mind." Cheryl's tone was light, almost amused. Roy took a deep breath. "I do mind." Cheryl smiled as if he were joking. "Well, next time I'll ask." Then she slid into the driver's seat, reversed out of the carport, and drove away. Roy stood there in the drizzle, heart pounding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an accident. Cheryl had crossed a line, and Roy knew. If he didn't stop it now, Cheryl was going to push even further. Roy had just started to relax after the carport incident when the next blow landed. It was a Monday morning, and Roy was sitting at his desk, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his emails when he saw it. Proposed emergency parking regulation, member vote required. Roy's eyebrows lifted as he opened the email. His stomach dropped as he read the details. The proposal stated that during emergency weather conditions, homeowners would be required to let neighbors park on their property if the street was blocked or flooded. The language was carefully worded, broad enough to be twisted to fit any situation. Roy sat back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. This wasn't just a coincidence. This had Cheryl written all over it. Sure enough, when he scrolled to the bottom of the email, there was, "Proposal submitted by HOA board member Cheryl Matthews." Roy's mouth tightened. Cheryl wasn't just trying to cover her tracks. She was trying to make it official. He fired off an email to the HOA board. "This proposal is unreasonable. Allowing neighbors to park on private property without permission is an invasion of privacy and could create unnecessary conflict. This rule is too vague and easy to exploit." A few hours later, the HOA president replied with a single line, "Thank you for your feedback. We'll discuss this at the next meeting." Roy sighed. He already knew how this was going to go. Cheryl had influence. She was the type of person who knew how to push just hard enough to get what she wanted without technically breaking the rules. At the meeting, Roy presented his objections clearly. He wasn't angry, just calm and direct. He explained how the rule could be manipulated and why it wasn't fair to homeowners. Cheryl sat across the room, that same tight smile on her face as Roy spoke. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She just smiled. When the vote came in, the rule passed by a narrow margin. As the meeting adjourned, Cheryl brushed past Roy in the hallway. "Looks like we'll all have to be good neighbors now," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. Roy clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He had played fair and lost. But something told him Cheryl wasn't done yet. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Roy had spent most of the day working from a coffee shop downtown. He had just pulled into his driveway when he noticed something strange. The side door to his garage was open. Roy's heart skipped a beat. He was meticulous about locking that door. He'd made a habit after Cheryl's last stunt. He walked toward the garage slowly, his pulse quickening. When he pushed the door open, his stomach dropped. Cheryl's SUV was parked inside. Right there in the middle of his garage, his office, next to his desk and computer setup. Roy stood frozen, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. Then he saw it. A small note taped to his office chair. Needed a place to park. The old code still worked. Hope you don't mind. Slightly smiling face. Roy's face flushed with heat. The old code. Months earlier, Cheryl had asked about Roy's insulation setup because she was considering something similar for her garage. Roy had given her the code so she could check it out while he was away. He had meant to change the code afterward, but clearly he had forgotten, and Cheryl had remembered. Roy stood there, breathing hard. His garage wasn't just a workspace. It was his sanctuary. The fact that Cheryl had let herself in without asking, it crossed every line. Roy stepped outside and dialed Cheryl's number. It went to voicemail. A few minutes later, Cheryl strolled over from her house, looking completely relaxed. "Hey, Roy." Roy held up the note. "What is this?" Cheryl smiled. "Oh, yeah. I needed a place to park. The street was blocked, so I figured I'd just use your garage." Roy's jaw tightened. "You used the code without asking." "Well, you gave me the code," Cheryl said with a shrug. "That was months ago," Roy said, his voice low. Cheryl's smile didn't fade. "I figured you wouldn't mind." Roy's eyes narrowed. "Cheryl, this isn't okay." Her smile faltered. "It's not a big deal, Roy." "It is to me." For the first time, Cheryl's expression hardened. "Fine," she said, her tone sharp. She got into her SUV and backed out of the garage without another word. Roy stood there, watching her drive away. His hands were shaking. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Cheryl knew exactly what she was doing, and Roy was done playing along. Later that evening, Roy was sitting on his porch, nursing a beer and trying to calm his nerves when Cheryl walked up his driveway. "You changed the code," she said flatly. Roy set his bottle down and stood. "Yes, I did." Cheryl crossed her arms. "Why?" Roy's expression stayed calm. "Because you trespass." Cheryl scoffed. "I was just parking." "In my garage," Roy replied. "Without permission." Cheryl's smile tightened. "I didn't think it was a big deal." Roy's gaze stayed steady. "That's the problem." Cheryl's eyes narrowed. "So, what? Are you to file a complaint? Call the cops." Roy took a step closer, his voice low and even. "No, but I need you to understand something. This cannot happen again. If it does, I will handle it." Cheryl's eyes flashed with something between annoyance and curiosity. "Handle it how?" Roy's mouth curled into a small smile. "Let's hope you don't have to find out." Cheryl's jaw tightened. "Fine." She spun on her heel and walked away. Roy watched her go, heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure why Cheryl kept pushing boundaries. Maybe it was about control. Maybe she thought she could intimidate him. But Roy wasn't going to let it happen again. Roy didn't have to wait long for Cheryl to cross the line again. A week later, Roy pulled into his driveway and saw it. Cheryl's SUV, parked inside his garage. Again, Roy's jaw tightened. His pulse spiked. That's it. Roy pulled out his phone and made a call. "Hey, Steve, you still have that tow truck?" An hour later, Steve's truck backed into the driveway. "You sure about this?" Steve asked, grinning as he hooked the SUV to the back of the truck. Roy smiled tightly. "Absolutely." Steve hauled the SUV away without a word. Roy leaned back against the garage door and waited. It didn't take long. An hour later, there was a loud, frantic knock on Roy's front door. Roy opened it to find Cheryl standing there, looking furious. "Where's my car?" she demanded. Roy crossed his arms. "Oh, you mean the one in my garage?" "Yes." Roy shrugged. "I had it towed." Cheryl's mouth fell open. "You what?" Roy's voice stayed calm. "It was on my property without permission. That's trespassing." Cheryl's face flushed red. "You had no right." Roy's eyes narrowed. Actually, I did, and I have security footage to prove it. Cheryl's hands balled into fists. You'll pay for this. Roy's gaze stayed steady. Go ahead and call the police. But just so you know, they'll see the footage. And they'll see the emails where I warned you. You sure you want to go down that road? Cheryl's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Finally, she turned and stomped away. Roy closed the door and smiled. For the first time in months, he felt like he was finally in control. Roy had just started to relax when it happened. A loud, deliberate knock on his front door. 3 sharp raps that felt more like a warning than a greeting. Roy's stomach tightened. He stood up from his couch, walked to the door, and peered through the peephole. Cheryl's husband. Roy had seen him a few times in passing. A tall, broad-shouldered guy with a serious face. He'd never spoken to him directly. But right now, that serious face looked anything but friendly. Roy opened the door slowly. Can I help you? Cheryl's husband stepped forward, hands resting on his hips. Where's the car? Roy's brow furrowed. Excuse me? My wife's car. His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Where is it? Roy crossed his arms. It was parked in my garage without permission. I had it towed. Cheryl's husband's mouth twitched, but he didn't smile. That was a mistake. Roy's jaw tightened. No, it wasn't. The man's eyes darkened. He took a step closer, looming over Roy. Listen carefully, he said, his voice low. You don't touch my wife's property. Ever. Roy didn't flinch. Then maybe your wife shouldn't be parking it in my garage. Cheryl's husband's nostrils flared. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You think this is funny? He said. No, Roy said evenly. But I'm not going to let Cheryl walk all over me anymore. The man's lips curled into a cold smile. You've made a big mistake. Roy's gaze didn't waver. Maybe, but I'm not backing down. For a long moment, they stood there, Roy's calm stare meeting Cheryl's husband's hard glare. Then, without another word, Cheryl's husband stepped back, his eyes still locked on Roy. Careful, Roy, he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away. Roy stood at the door long after he left. His heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was from anger. This wasn't over. And Roy knew it. 2 days later, an email from the HOA board popped up in Roy's inbox. Emergency HOA meeting, property dispute discussion. Attendance strongly encouraged. Roy sighed and closed his laptop. He already knew exactly what this was about. That Thursday evening, Roy showed up at the HOA meeting hall. The place was packed, more than usual. Word had clearly spread. People were leaning in, whispering to one another. Roy took a seat toward the back, his folder of evidence resting on his lap. Cheryl sat across the room with her husband, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The HOA president stood at the front of the room. We've called this emergency meeting to address a complaint about the unauthorized towing of a resident's vehicle. Cheryl immediately stood up. I'd like to speak first. Roy's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course she would. Cheryl walked to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who expected to win. She smoothed down her skirt and smiled. My neighbor Roy, she began, her voice steady, had my car towed from his property without any warning or justification. He claims I was trespassing, but I was acting under the emergency parking rule. A rule I helped pass, by the way. Roy's jaw clenched. Cheryl continued, her tone smooth and rehearsed. Roy has been difficult from the beginning. He's been hostile toward me ever since I joined the board. This isn't just about parking, it's personal. She finished with a satisfied smile and sat down. A few whispers passed through the crowd. Cheryl's husband was watching Roy closely. The HOA president looked toward Roy. Roy. Roy stood slowly. He walked to the front of the room without rushing, his folder in hand. He took a breath and scanned the room before he spoke. I'd like to present some evidence, Roy said, his tone calm and even. He held up a printed copy of the emergency parking rule Cheryl had proposed. This is the rule Cheryl pushed through the board. Notice the language, vague enough to cover just about anything. Cheryl's smile tightened. Roy set it down and held up a security photo. This is Cheryl's SUV parked in my garage. Without my permission. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Roy held up a handwritten note Cheryl had left behind. Needed a place to park. The old code still worked. Hope you don't mind. Slightly smiling face. Roy's gaze sharpened. I gave Cheryl that code months ago for a one-time inspection. She wasn't supposed to keep it. But instead of asking, she let herself in. Cheryl's mouth twisted. Roy lifted his chin. This was an emergency. This was trespassing. The room fell into stunned silence. Cheryl's husband's jaw tightened. Roy kept his voice calm. I warned Cheryl. I asked her to stop. When she didn't, I handled it. Roy paused. If anyone here thinks I was wrong, feel free to tell me now. No one spoke. The HOA president's gaze swept the room. Well, I think we have enough information to proceed. It wasn't even close. When the vote was called to remove Cheryl from the HOA board, it passed almost unanimously. Only one person voted to keep her husband. Cheryl's face was frozen in disbelief as the results were read. Roy sat back in his chair, his face calm. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. When the meeting ended, several neighbors approached Roy, shaking his hand. Good for you, Roy. About time someone stood up to her. She had it coming. Roy gave polite nods, but he wasn't looking for praise. He just wanted his life back. Cheryl's husband stalked out of the room without a word. Cheryl followed, her face red and tight with frustration. Roy watched them go. For the first time in months, he felt like the weight on his chest was finally lifting. The for sale sign went up the following week. Roy saw it while walking back from his mailbox. Cheryl's house was being listed. A few days later, moving trucks pulled into her driveway. Cheryl stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the movers load furniture into the trucks. Roy stood on his own porch, coffee cup in hand. Cheryl's gaze drifted toward him. Their eyes met. Roy gave her a small, respectful nod. Not smug, just closure. Cheryl's face remained hard. She held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked inside. By the end of the day, the house was empty. Cheryl and her husband were gone. That night, Roy stood in his garage. His workspace was back the way he liked it, organized and peaceful. He closed a new keypad, triple-checked the code, and smiled to himself. A few days later, Roy was sitting on his porch when his neighbor Tom walked by. How's it feel? Tom asked. Roy smiled. Quiet. Tom chuckled. Think she learned her lesson? Roy shrugged. Maybe. He leaned back. But I learned mine. Tom raised his eyebrows. Oh, yeah. Roy's smile deepened. It's not about being aggressive. It's about setting boundaries and sticking to them. Tom nodded thoughtfully. Amen to that. Roy sat back, letting the sun warm his face. His garage was secure. His peace was restored. And this time, he knew it was going to stay that way.